Does anyone even remember those ridiculous mandates that were imposed upon the majority of the United States during the COVID 19 pandemic? Do you remember the lockdowns? Do you remember the mask mandates? Do you remember the travel restrictions? Do you remember mandatory vaccinations? Do you remember your churches closed and pastors arrested? Do you remember your businesses being closed so you couldn't earn, but every big box store was still open? Do you remember being able to contact your loved ones only through a plastic sheet or FaceTime them in a hospital, many for the last time? Do you remember being forced to stand 6 feet from your fellow human being? Do you remember needing a mask to walk through a restaurant, but not at the table? Are you one of the people that blame the federal government, or more specifically, the Biden administration, for violating your rights? Well, it might surprise you to know that your government on a federal level isn't that stupid. The feds would have to jump through miles of hoops to violate the constitutionally protected rights that were violated during the pandemic, only to have it overturned quite quickly in the Supreme Court. So if these unconstitutional mandates didn't come from the White House, where did they come from? It might come as a surprise to you that in 44 states across our nation, state governors granted themselves sweeping authority under the guise of emergency conditions, violating many constitutionally protected rights with very limited immediate legal recourse. Of course, many were later overturned in federal court, but not before exacting historical, economic, and social havoc throughout most of the country. Today, we delve into a critical aspect of governance that has become increasingly relevant in recent times, and that's the scope of emergency powers held by state governors. Recently, the governor of New Mexico, Michelle Grisham, suspended the Second Amendment right to bear arms, stating that the Constitution was never meant as an absolute. And not only do I disagree with that statement, but neither did the people of New Mexico, and showed up armed and in numbers to let her know. Even the sheriff refused to support it, choosing instead to keep his higher oath to the people of New Mexico and to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This sheriff realized that only laws carry enforceability of law and was brave enough to stand up for it. Well, it wasn't long after that a federal judge also agreed and blocked it. On a personal note, I give Governor Grisham credit for having the courage to announce publicly of her intention to restrict guns in parts of New Mexico instead of burying it in a word salad like the next governor of our focus. Let's at the very least acknowledge that Governor Green New Deal's proclamation, much like many other ambitious policy initiatives, can have significant implications for our state and indeed our lives. The fact that he buried all of the constitutionally violated rights in a supplemental document and didn't come right out and explain the content does not speak well for a man that the public is already suspicious of. State governors in the United States possess substantial emergency powers authorized by the state laws, but they are limited by their constitutions. These powers enable governors to act swiftly and decisively during a crisis, often without the need for immediate legislative approval. But here's the question we really have to consider. Are these sweeping powers a litmus test to gauge how much the public is willing to tolerate in the face of an emergency? It's a legitimate concern, especially when these emergency powers can, and in most cases do, infringe upon our cherished individual liberties, and in particular, those that are already protected by both the United States Constitution and the states' constitutions. For instance, the First Amendment, our bedrock of free speech and assembly, can be put to the test when emergency measures impose restrictions on public gatherings, limit our ability to voice dissent, and as Governor Green New Deal did, suspend all electronic media as it's clearly laid out in 127.13.6, which defines the additional powers in an emergency period. The Second Amendment, which protects our right to bear arms, is already under the fire in the state of Hawaii, which is some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country, which at some point must face legal scrutiny. 127A 1312 makes it quite clear that this amendment was unlawfully suspended. Fifth Amendment, guarding against deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process, becomes relevant when it's spelled out in black and white in 127A 1311 that even privately owned property can be taken over to ensure the continuity of critical infrastructure. The 10th Amendment, affirming that powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people and are limited to the confines of the Constitution. In other words, you can't make laws that actually break the supreme law of the land. The 14th Amendment, which ensures equal protection under the law and safeguards due process, which from a legal lens, emergency proclamation, executive orders, and mandates are not created from due process, but by individual decree, and no single person, at least in the United States of America, has that kind of power. And lastly, maybe someone can explain why on God's green earth in section 127.13.1, there are additional powers granted to the governor to quarantine or segregate persons who are affected with or just believed to have been infected or exposed to any infectious disease. Can anybody tell me what that has to do with shortage of housing, which is what the governor said this illegal proclamation was about in the first place? When we asked the people if they read the governor's emergency proclamation, nearly everyone said they had. However, very few looked up the reference codes that went on to further define the actual laws that were being suspended. I cannot blame anyone for not noticing it, though, because it looks like they were hidden deliberately. These constitutional concerns underscore the delicate balance we must strike between addressing crises effectively and safeguarding our individual rights and liberties. It's a challenge that demands ongoing scrutiny and engagement from us as vigilant citizens. We must remember that the strength of our constitutional republic lies in its checks and balances. While emergency powers are essential to manage crises effectively, they also demand vigilant oversight to ensure they are not misused or abused as they have been in recent years. The question of whom exactly should stand in vigil in defense of our quickly eroding constitutionally protected several liberties if we can't trust our governing bodies to do it? The answer is simple. Article 1, Section 1 of the Hawaii State Constitution says all political power of this state is inherent in the people, and the responsibility for the exercise thereof rests with the people. How people have done it before is take to the street in the form of demonstration and even outright defiance, as we saw in the successful movement in Mauna Kea, as well as the recent restriction on guns in New Mexico. In conclusion, the scope of emergency powers held by state governors is a crucial matter that deserves more than our attention and reflection. It's clear that the responsibility and duty of safeguarding our individual rights and liberties falls on the shoulders of the people, just as it states in our Hawaii State Constitution. In other words, it's our responsibility to keep our governments in check and ensure the Constitution remains the foundation for which all laws are made, and all future mandates, proclamations, or executive orders respect the Constitution as the absolute supreme law of the land. My name is Ethan Shelton. Aloha.